We are in 1 Corinthians. I have it marked down as chapter 7 and verse 25. Is anybody good there? All right. So we'll pick up there and continue our discussion in 1 Corinthians. So, beginning reading there in verse 25, and let's, don't know that we'll get quite to the end of the chapter, but let's just read. So 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 25 beginning says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this day, I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God." So, we did finish the chapter there, but as we look at that, what do you first, from the beginning of where we started reading here today, what is the first thing that maybe catches your attention? Is this speaking to us directly in all ways today? No. What's the clincher that tells us that this is not a direct application for us?
Probably the present distress.
Yeah. There is something going on in the church. There's something that is a present distress for the people at that time. The difficulties, of the flesh, of physical life at that time. And so, for that period of time, it is being said that it would be better for you to just remain as you are. Why do you think that would be? What is Paul's point? Why would it be better not to get married or change the status of where you're at in life?
First of all, I've heard this, that it was thought that the present distress was identified to some, as they studied, that it was a political issue. The Romans being in power and being over the Jews, and so that may or may not have been, I don't know.
Right.
Present distress seems to me to indicate if you've got difficulty in that getting married and changing the status of both the people that would get married would constitute some problems in that relationship from the get-go, because of the fact that whatever this present distress is would have an impact. And so it would be better, in Paul's opinion, as he said, and he does state that again even at the end of the chapter. He said, I think I have the right idea here. But that you don't get yourself into another situation such as marriage and have it complicated by this distress and not being able to be the right kind of relationship that should be sought after between married people.
And he says it quite clearly that this, if you do choose to be married, it's not a sin. It's not a prohibition of that action. It's just a matter. It's a very pragmatic, sensible way to look at this, and it's understandable. I mean, which of us that, as I look around, very many of us are married, and as we think about that, can you be married successfully and be absent in some way because of something that you have going on? If you have, jobs have torn people apart before in a relationship because they become so busy with the job that they don't leave time for the relationship of the marriage. And it is something that, in our world today, people treat marriage like it's just yesterday's garbage sometimes, because they just assume that, well, I guess our time has run out, we've fallen out of love, sort of thing. But when you look back at how it may have started, it probably starts with an unwillingness to service that relationship, if you will, to be there for that other person and to be a part of their life and be a support one to another. And so that takes time, that takes effort. That's something that is not, you can't just mail that in. And so Paul's kind of pointing that out, that you have to really take this seriously, that this is something that is going to take some time. And as Rick pointed out, there at the very end, he brings it back around and says, I think I also have the Spirit of God. And as he says that again. In verse 28, he says, nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. He's trying to warn of this issue and trying to spare some heartache and trouble amongst the Lord's people for this time. So, it's very understandable. And these are scriptures that are often, I think, twisted and taken out of context in the religious world today. There are, I'm certain, those that would use this to qualify what happens in some of the religions where they forbid marriage, where they forbid that relationship from taking place, and especially when it comes to the idea of the virgin being able to continue to serve the Lord without the thought of anything else. Those are things that have been twisted and wrested along the way by mankind in the religious world. But a study of the context and the entirety of what is being spoken here points out that this was something for a specific time, for a specific distress. But there's a lot of wisdom in this passage that we can think about the seriousness of those covenant relationships, I suppose, that we would get into. Anybody else have thoughts, or did I talk you out?
Well, if people go into marriage knowing divorce is not an option,
Yeah.
they have no choice but to work it out.
Yeah. And that's the right attitude to have. I mean, if you listen to, I suppose there may be somebody that would marry someone and not say these words, but it's pretty clear in most marriages that I've attended, all of them that I can think of, it is said that this is until death do us part. they're not taken as seriously as they should be. That's for certain. And people do start out with that idea that, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce.
So we've been talking all the way through these chapters, and it goes back to the beginning of this chapter where they talk about if their spouse is not a Christian or it is a Christian, they can leave or they don't leave. In this version that I have, in verse 27, it says, "Do you have a wife? Don't seek a divorce. Are you divorced from your wife? Don't seek another." So that kind of, goes back to the fact that he was talking to them about not divorcing or not, if your spouse leaves, don't seek another. And this translation makes it more tied to what that was at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not necessarily don't get married, but if you've been divorced, don't get married.
True. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Charles?
So, I have a couple of thoughts. In the beginning, when God created man, he seen man that needed a companion. And so, maybe it's me thinking into it too much, but God could have initially thought, hey, man could just do everything. And then, okay, man needs a companion, and in order to have more than one man, we would need to create a female. And so there was some thought there onto why. Now, in this argument here, we kind of almost see that it would be easier to serve the Lord if that's all you had to think about. And then having a companion, there are times where, and people outside of the church don't often understand that, my family is my bond, or my spouse is my bond. And God is not ranked first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they're trying to get here. God still has to have the number one priority because your spouse may not go to heaven, but in order for you to go to heaven, you have to have God first.
Right.
Putting your spouse first means you're putting something of earth above God, and that will never get you to heaven.
Yeah.
So that's one thought I have. The other one is, you talk about this time of crisis. I would imagine that in this time of crisis, let's think back to, they could be marrying to solve problems or to further grow humanity as it will. And so he's saying that if we just leave things the way they were, ultimately you'd be following God's plan and it'll work itself out. We know people today that marry because of a child, and obviously if divorce is an option, they end up taking that option a lot of times. Not always, but it does happen. And so if you had God first, then obviously you wouldn't have had a child. But even if God wasn't first and you ended up with a child, before you make the commitment to marriage, you should really put God back to being first.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's, putting the cart before the horse, is what many people do. They'll enter into relations with somebody and conceive a child, and then they'll get married. And sometimes that's a horrible matchup. And there are people that are in situations where now they are bound to this person until death do they part. And sometimes, there can be abuse in the situation. And certainly, there's a difference between, a separation and a divorce. There may be a time where, if you just can't live with each other, then, well, you've made your bed. And now there are certain things you cannot do. You can't just go on and act like that marriage never happened. It's very heavy stuff to think about.
The other thing that I'd like to state, and then I'd also state for the record, I am not 100% on this, something that I would really do not have enough understanding of. But marriage by man and marriage under God are not the same. And I think that he binds things differently. And so in my opinion, he may say having child with someone may bound you. Again, I do not know for certain. God's eyes, his version of marriage and man's version of marriage are not quite the same.
Right.
And so that's a subject for another day, but again, what they're talking about here is also kind of a man's mix of the law versus God's.
Mm-hmm. my first blush, and we won't go too far because you're right. That's a whole other can of worms that is down a little bit deeper. We need to dig that one up later. But you know, your marriage is a covenant. It's a promise, and at the point that you say those words and that you make that covenant promise with another person, you know, in front of God and everybody else, God has ordained that is something that He is going to hold and bind, and that's about as much as I think I want to say about that now. When it comes into the idea of fornication creating that kind of a bond, my first blush is I'm not in that camp, but that is definitely worth studying, looking into. You know, that each of us definitely, and maybe we can do that as we move forward at some point and study that with a little bit more of a deep dive.
And I think, without reading into it, I think that's some of the warning he may be saying here.
Yeah.
I think he's giving warning. Again, we don't know all of the circumstances, but I think that's the warning that he's trying to get into is let's not make a bad situation worse.
Right. Yeah, in my mind, whether I'm, you know, I for the record,
I don't want to say it.
For the record, I stand ready to be corrected, but I think that there's you know, when you think of the relations outside of marriage being fornication and or adultery, I think that the hairline goes somewhere in that's kind of where we're going to find the delineation for that kind of a thing. But the bottom line, what we absolutely can know is that God takes that promise, that binding contract, if you will, of marriage between a man and a woman. He takes that very seriously, and so it's something that that we have to as well. If we're
Jesus has said it's one man, one woman, and I don't know of any place in the Old Testament where God said in order for a male and a female to be married that they have to do this particular process. I look at it from the point of view that God has instituted all of the governments, with the exception of those governments that will honor one man with multiple women. We know that's against God's will. But for the rest, you know, if I go into downtown Cleveland and I go to a justice of the peace and I get married, I'm married.
mm-hmm.
If I go to what Linda and I did, we were Lutheran at the time, and we were married. We're married.
Yeah.
And so,
You know, the standing before God and everybody else and making that commitment to one another, that is in alignment with you know, God's will.
right.
That there be a union there between man and woman. The other things, you know, as far as, you know, perhaps as you mentioned, polygamy and other things that are, again, God's law comes first. So if man makes a law that says something against God's law, then, well, God has the first position there, and his law would usurp and nullify whatever mankind would say.
Yeah, if I decided to go down to Columbus and say, hey, I'll pay the $75 so that I can be entitled in the state of Ohio to marry people. If I marry someone, in God's eyes, they're married.
Right. Yeah, I don't even think it's that much. I have one of those papers on the wall back there.
I don't think it's that much either.
it's one of those things that I chalk that up to the things that God winked at. That he never did allow, he never liked those things, but he gave people a lot of rope to hang themselves, you know, when during those times. But now he's laid down the
I
law.
think Jesus, put an end to that.
Yes, yeah, certainly.
It was just like God tolerated a lot of things
Yeah,
because the people, they just couldn't control themselves, and so, they just were, like you say, given a wide berth, and God didn't denounce it, and so.
look what was said about David and all of the things that he did.
Right.
You know, that kind of gives you an idea of the things that God winked at.
I've heard it said in a sermon before, the reason in the Old Testament some of those things were allowed was just simple population growth. Obviously, you wouldn't marry your brother or your sister, but in the beginning, there was only two people and we all came from those people. So obviously something had to come along the way.
It's
But the reality is, he made it so.
yeah. I mean, what we can say in looking at the scriptures in Genesis, there was the first marriage between a man and a woman. And we can see that God allowed for certificates of divorce for very specific reasons along the way. But again, this was never something that God intended or wanted to happen. And mankind did the things that they did, and God, as the old law was kind of rolling things forward until Christ, those things I think are kind of rolled up in with that, from what I can tell in the scriptures. And as Jim pointed out, Christ put an end to that, to those things.
God would have punished everybody for all the wrong things they did in the Old Testament. There wouldn't be anybody left.
That's
I mean, that would have been the end of the human race, and God knew that.
right.
And we're weak,
And it's true about us today. I mean, there's not a one of us that is worthy of the calling and the hope that we have in Christ. So I mean, the very same thing would be true of us.
Didn't Jesus say that the Father allowed it to happen, but in the beginning it was not so?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's God's end of the stick. Why He let those things happen, I don't know, but He certainly had His hands full with the disobedient people that His people have always been.
Even Solomon, as wise as he was with the wisdom that God gave him, his wives, his many, many wives, were his eventual downfall.
Yeah,
He couldn't handle it, I guess.
and I'm sure some people might say this and think, and you might, I'm really not saying this as a joke. I'm not trying to be funny. But, if you think about if you're married, think about, can you really, and this goes in both directions. Angela, could you imagine there being another me walking around the house getting into trouble? And, I couldn't imagine it the other way around, enough's enough, and while that's, I even mentioned last week that, Angela's such a blessing in my life. I'm not making light of any of that, but there's great wisdom in what God did between one man and one woman, and not convoluting the things. I mean, if you, just in popular culture, a few years back there was a cable television show that kind of outlined the lives of people that were involved in polygamy. And one of the reasons that television show was, I think, probably popular is because it was like a soap opera because of all the drama that happened because of the different factions within the family. And it was, you look at that and think, well, that's just an absolute mess. And that's not the way that God intended the relationship to be.
Not that I would disagree with the whole drama, but I think it's also curiosity, and there's obviously a group of people that would say, well, if it was allowed there, it must be okay.
Right.
Again, you have to realize that Satan
it's God's law first. And for the group that has become famous through the last couple hundred years, for allowing polygamy within their religion over to the west. It started actually up here to the northeast of us, and then they traveled west to be able to do the things that they wanted to do. When you research the history, their law came way after what we have written in the scriptures, and we have, the scriptures tell us that if anybody brings anything different than what was first delivered, let them be accursed. And so here we have, and I can't remember when Mr. Smith up here to the northeast got his revelation, so to speak, on those tablets or plates for the Mormon from the angel Moroni. I don't remember what year that was, and this is all according to him. But it was certainly within the last 250, 300 years, way after what we have written in the scriptures.
Plus, all of the stories that aren't from the scriptures say, well, Smith went alone into the woods and came across these tablets alone. And that's the same with every single story. Oh, they found this alone. They came to this revelation alone. They were alone in bed when but God and these scriptures from Jesus, multitudes saw them. There was thousands of people who saw them, and in historical artifacts that say that they saw it. It's not just one person saying that they saw it.
Yeah, and it's confirmed several times throughout the entirety of the scriptures. For one thing, we have the Gospels, written from different perspectives that say the very same thing, that support, the life and times of Christ here on this earth. So all those things, you can tell it for what it is. When it's something that is not from God, it's pretty easy to find that out if you study the Word of God. To just as Paul points out at the very end, to get back to our text here, when Paul said, I think I also have the Spirit of God. To some degree, we can have that same Spirit of God, the mind of Christ, if you will, by reading and studying the Word, and the Word is able to make application and dig itself into our mind and make changes in the way that we think.
I was going to say, anything of God is not contradictory. And I mean, it could be my opinion, but I don't think man is able to create anything, even a large group of man, and it not be contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
He's just incapable of making it. And I think that goes to show that because God knows every possible outcome, and He is the creator, He has it so. I mean, it just kind of goes to show you where you can take any religion and find its contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
But what's in the Bible you can find out.
Right. Now, the one other thing sticking out here in verse 39, and I know Rick, you had pointed this out, and I have not come to any other conclusions about this statement of, in verse 39 it says, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. So did you want to say anything about verse 39 and that statement of only in the Lord?
Well, I think we're going to get into that in a little while, but that requires some study.
Yes.
Because there's different opinions on it.
Right.
I'm not even sure my position, really. I think I know what I think.
The one thing that I guess I would start my thoughts with, and as we move forward, again, to just keep this idea of context in place here, he's talking through these things and talking about things that he believes are a good idea from his estimation, which is trustworthy. And so, at the very least, this advice for a wife who loses her husband, as her husband dies, and she decides to marry another, her choice. Paul's advice, at the very least, we can say that his advice is that she should be only married in the Lord. Angela, you have something there?
Yeah, my translation says if a married woman must remain with her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but only if the man is a Christian. And then it says, there's a little quote that says, in quotes, only if the Lord guides her. So I don't know if that.
Yeah. And that's, I guess the delineation here again is going to be do we take this snippet in the middle of all of the things that are being said by Paul as wise, sage advice? Do we take this snippet as law, or do we consider it to be still a part of what he's been saying as wise, sage advice that is absolutely, incontrovertibly, this is the best way to do it. And if you are a Christian, if you love the Lord, why would you put yourself in a position, why would you knowingly put yourself in a position where you now are in a covenant relationship with somebody who doesn't have the same goal, the same purpose in mind? That doesn't make logical sense that you would want to do that. So certainly that's the thing to do. Whether or not it is law, that's something we will continue to look at. I know Rick had given me some information on this, and I want to keep digging into it too, because like he said, this is going to take some time to go through.
We've mentioned it in other classes. This touches on the idea of is love and the idea of love something of man or something from our Creator? Because his version of love is not quite what we think.
Oh,
We've
certainly.
seen that written in the Bible. And so, if you're remarrying and you say, well, it's because of love, remember that love could be lust under the Lord's eyes.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand that I think the writer here is saying this because he's coming from almost like God's angle. And I don't want to say through God's eyes, but he's coming from it as the way, not like you said, the best way, but he's coming from the most pure way of God first. And that's why he's writing it.
In the discourse that Christ has where he says, do you love me? Then tend my sheep. Do you love me?
Yeah.
Feed my sheep. As he goes through that, there's an escalation of that word love. It's translated love, and just love, and love. But when you look back to the actual words that are being used in the Koine Greek, it moves up from like a friendly love to a deep, abiding love. And so yes, we use the idea of love as it is understood by popular culture in the world today is way out of the field. Certainly true. Anything else?
I think if we just keep that in mind when trying to understand this, that love and marriage are not, they're not today's terms of love and marriage.
Right.
It's just not the same. This is different.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we will pick up in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 next time. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Thanks for all of the good comments. We have Anderson is going to bring us the invitation of the hour. So I'll turn it over to him.
Please excuse me while we get set up here. So, the entire concept for this invitation I came across while watching a video, and the guy mentioned an idea that was brought up about biblically accurate angels. And thing I don't really know too much about, but what I do know is that they use Ezekiel 10:9-12. If we can look to, if we turn to Ezekiel 10:9-12, and it says there, and when I looked, there were 4 wheels by the cherubim, 1 wheel by one cherub, and another wheel by each other cherub. The wheels appeared to have the color of a beryl stone. As for their appearance, all 4 looked alike, as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they went toward any of their 4 directions. They did not turn aside when they went, but followed in the direction the head was facing. They did not turn aside when they went, and there were their whole body, with their back, their hands, their wings, and the wheels that the 4 had were full of eyes all around. And if I had planned this more, I would have had a slideshow that I could show you a picture of one of these things that people have described, but it's just interesting to me that they use this verse to describe something that's supposed to be completely accurate, because they say angels, and as far as I understand, cherubims and angels are 2 different things. And if we go to chapter 8 of Ezekiel, verse 3, it says, "He stretched out the form of a hand and took me by the lock of my hair, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the image of jealousy was, which provokes to jealousy." And that language, when I was studying this after hearing this, makes me think that this entire thing's a vision. It's not really, real. And the thing that what wanted me to bring this up this evening was context. I can't fully remember, but a while back, my father came up to me and showed me something where this guy had said how they're building a kitchen in their church. And he showed me the verse that the guy uses to show that the Lord allows you to have a kitchen in the church. But then, if you go back just 2 verses, there was the answer to why this circumstance is different. And I can't remember that. I didn't remember to ask him anything about it before. But it's just to remember that it's important that context is always used when you're looking at things. Because you can nitpick verses to say anything, but if you take them out of context, in context, things are what the Lord wants. Out of context, they are not. And as invitation goes, we have to realize why this is so important. Because if you take things out of context, you're not hearing what the Lord wants. And that can be confusing for someone who is trying to learn about the Lord if this person's saying this using this verse, but then this verse contradicts that. Why does this verse contradict this verse? Because this verse is taken out of context. And if that happens, then the next step of salvation may not be achieved. Belief. You have to hear, and then you have to believe. You're not going to believe if it's confusing. And once you've heard, believed, you have to repent of those sins that you've heard, that you've committed, and cleansed of. And once you've heard, believed, and repented, you need to confess your sins and that Jesus is the Son of God. And then you have to be baptized in the Lord. And then you have to repent of those. You have to remain faithful until death. You can't be baptized and just continue in sin. You have to remain faithful until the day you die. And we also, I think it is important to remember that Jesus has all authority, leaving us nothing. It says in Matthew 28:18, and Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And anybody in the military knows that if someone has all authority, that means that you have nothing. You don't have authority to do anything. You just do what they're telling you to do. You're not going to go off and do your own thing. What they tell you to do is what that you do, because that's the authority that they have and you have nothing. Unless, of course, you're the higher up one with authority. But in this scenario, he's the one with all the authority. So we have to remember that what man says is completely useless to us. The only one with enough authority to tell us what we are to do in life is the Lord Jesus Christ. If there's anyone among us that needs to be baptized in Christ, or if any of you have found that you need the prayers of the saints for something you have done, please come forward as we stand and sing.
Who at my door is standing, patiently drawing near, entrance within demanding, whose is the voice I hear? Sweetly the tones are falling, open the door for me.
This was so good, Evans and Donna. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Good trip.